Thanks very much, Catherine, and thanks to the Talent Dividend Network and CEOs for Cities for having us on today. And thanks to all of you for taking time out of your schedules to join us for the webinar. As Catherine said, I work for the Western Interstate Commission for Higher Education, also known as WICHE. For the most part, WICHE is focused on state policy in the western states. You can see our member states up there now. But in a lot of situations where it really kind of serves the interest of our states, we branch out and undertake some projects that reach beyond the West and beyond state policy. And the Adult College Completion Network that I'm here to talk to you about today is one of those cases. The Adult College Completion Network, it operates on somewhat of a similar principle as the Talent Dividend Network. The idea is to really share some of the promising policies and practices that our members are developing as they work with adults, trying to bring them back to college, and share as much as we can to talk through some of the common challenges and common difficulties, and really, wherever possible, to keep reinvention of the wheel to the minimum. In the Adult College Completion Network, it's funded by Lumina Foundation. And what they did about 3 years ago is launch a pretty large-scale funding initiative where they gave out funds to 18 large-scale projects that were all reaching out to adults and trying to bring them back to increase their degree completion rates. And as part of that, they gave us some funding to form this network to really provide an opportunity for all of those projects to work together and share some of what they're doing. And I apologize if something keeps popping up about color, but that's showing up on my computer for some reason. But anyway, so Lumina funded this and started the network to help out the grantees that they funded really share some of what they're finding. But the foundation was also very intentional in asking us to reach out beyond the grantees and to partner with all those across the country who are working on this issue. So as part of that, we're working with state higher ed agencies, projects based in metropolitan areas, projects based in the workforce sector, and a lot of national organizations that are reaching out through partner institutions across the country. There is a website that's up at the bottom of your screen, and through the website there are some resources that are available, policy briefs, there's a listserv, there's a lot of research and some examples of marketing campaigns that I'll talk about in a little bit. But the network itself is open to everyone, and you can access and find out how to join the network on the website. And really what we do is, as I said, try to share as much as we can the good work that's going on across the country. So the overriding assumption of the Adult College Completion Network is that we have these ambitious attainment goals, whether they're at the national level in something like the Lumina Foundation's big goal or the Obama administration's completion goal, or at the state or local level where there are different attainment goals. But everybody has these goals. But for the most part, the data are pretty clear that we won't be able to reach them by focusing on the traditional education pipeline alone. No matter what sort of improvements that we make, in most cases, we really can't reach these goals unless we also bring adults into the equation. And I know that a lot of folks on the call are probably pretty much in the choir, so to speak, on why educational attainment matters. So I'll skip through this pretty quickly. There's a lot of data from Georgetown and others about the future workforce needs and how many educated workers that we'll need in the future. And most of those projections show that we're going to face a pretty significant education gap. Some of the latest data from Georgetown suggests that by 2020, we're going to face a shortfall of about 5 million workers with post-secondary education. And that's basically with no improvements in any of the pipelines, traditional or otherwise. And there's also a lot of arguments around economic competitiveness, whether you're looking at it from the national perspective of competing with other countries or the local perspective of how do cities compete for new jobs and for economic development. A lot of the research is pretty clear that education attainment is the key. I think one thing that's important here is that we can't discount the individual benefits that sometimes get lost in these broader discussions. Unfortunately, a lot of what you see and what you hear and read around the country is that college isn't worth it anymore. We hear the anecdotes of people living in their parents' basement, or graduates that are unemployed or underemployed. But the fact is, when you look at any of the available data, whether it's income, whether it's employment rates, et cetera, what you find is the value of a college degree compared to not graduating from college is actually increasing. And unfortunately, you don't see that story in the news too often. And I know this is all preaching to the choir to a great extent, but I think it's a very important foundation for the discussion that we're going to have. And I think it's also important for those of us working in this area to counter this misinformation whenever possible. So the big question, why can't we get there by fixing the traditional pipeline? The bottom line is that we have an aging workforce, our economy is increasingly knowledge-driven, and our education pipeline coming in from the K through 12 system is basically flat well into the future. Nationwide, the number of high school graduates that we're expecting over the next 15 years isn't expected to grow at all. As a quick side note, WICHE has been doing projections of high school graduates for the last, probably 20 years. And they go out 15 to 20 years into the future. And the latest projections just came out, and they're mostly at the state level. But for the first time coming out, hopefully next month, we'll have projections of the high school graduates in the largest 25 MSAs by population. And I know that doesn't necessarily cover everybody on the webinar, but hopefully for those of you that are in that category, it can be useful. And as soon as that comes out, I'll be sure to share it with Catherine and with the Talent Dividend folks so they can get it out to everybody. But that shows what the projections are for high school graduates by race and ethnicity out through 2027. So that can be pretty useful in making the case that you can't get to any of your attainment goals without focusing on adults.
I think we might be having some technical difficulties. It seems that we lost Pat for a second. Hold on 1 second with us. We'll catch him, and we'll pick up right where we left off. Sorry about this.
Maybe I'll just go over this slide again. The idea that we can't reach our education attainment goals without bringing adults into the picture. The workforce is graying. We have a larger number of adults who are leaving it who have degrees. And we're not expecting much growth in the K through 12 graduates at this point. Some of the projections that WICHE has done show flat lines in the number of high school graduates that we're expecting out through 2027. So the bottom line there is that if states improved their traditional pipelines and could wave a magic wand and everybody could perform at the level of the top 3 performing states, we'd still fall far short of our workforce needs by 2018. So with that as a bit of background, I thought I'd turn quickly to some of the data that we have on adults with significant college credit. In the work that we've done, there's a lot of different names for these adults. Some people call them near completers, stop-outs, ready adults. Some folks are using the term post-traditional students. But whatever the name is, the population that our network is focusing on for the most part are those that have significant college credit. We leave that specific definition up to the projects that we're working with. But for the most part, people are looking at adults who maybe have half of the credits necessary for a degree or 3/4, depending on their specific context. And we used to, when we were talking about this group, call them the low-hanging fruit. We thought it would be relatively easy to come, do a few policy changes, an advertising campaign, et cetera, and get them to all come back very quickly. What we find is that's just not the case. These adults face significant challenges. Their time is quite short with family commitments, work commitments, et cetera. And getting them back and meeting the different challenges and helping them overcome the barriers that they face is by no means easy. So what we know about adults with some credit but no degree is that they're basically, there isn't a lot of data out there. The census data that we have, which is terrific, but it's limited to the some college no degree category. That obviously includes somebody who has just a few credits all the way up to somebody who has maybe 120 credits. Also, these adults don't fit into the first-time, full-time category of students. And that's important for those of you who are working in institutions or otherwise connected to the higher ed data world. That's the definition that the main federal database on education statistics uses. It's known as IPEDS. So these adults don't really get counted in that system, which is unfortunate, and it makes the work that we're doing and evaluating that work a lot more difficult. And finally, at the institutional level, there's not necessarily a lot of work to track these students specifically. People aren't necessarily looking at this as a discrete population. In some of the best cases, they get lumped in with general adult students, and there's some data about that. But in other cases, there's simply no data at all available about adult students. So what we've done, we've gone and looked back at the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth. And that's quite a mouthful. But it's a federal survey, and they've been interviewing the same 12,000 people on a regular basis since 1979. So they do these interviews every year. At this point, they're doing it every 2 years. So it's a very rich data source on educational outcomes, income, employment, et cetera. And so we've done a little bit of looking through that to see, in this one particular cohort, what these adults with significant college credit might look like. And what we find, if you look here, we've done a little bit of looking at the income levels. And going across the screen, you see what someone with a high school diploma might earn from this cohort: associate's degree, bachelor's degree, above bachelor's degree. And then all the way over on the right are the near completers. And we needed a specific definition to go through the data. So what we picked was somebody who had completed 2 years of post-secondary education, had not earned a degree, and had been not enrolled in post-secondary education for at least 3 years. This is obviously a fairly arbitrary definition, and it doesn't really include folks who are working towards an associate's degree, but it was a starting point for us. So this is just kind of a preliminary analysis, and it shows that they're earning quite a bit below what somebody who has a bachelor's degree might earn, and just above, statistically about equivalent to what somebody with an associate's degree would earn. Some of the other statistics that are interesting that are in the survey are things that predict college access and success. Up here you see a library card. This is whether back in 1979 the individuals who are near completers or any of these other degree levels had a library card. And again, what you find is that they kind of fit in right between those with associate's degrees and those with bachelor's degrees. The same holds true if you look at mother's education and father's education, which are also great predictors of educational success. So for the most part, so far, it's just confirming a lot of what we might expect, but it's nice to have some data on that. And then taking a look, too, at poverty level growing up. Again, what you find is that they're slightly less likely to be in poverty when they were younger compared to those who ended up earning associate's degrees. And on the ASVAB score, which is a standardized test that was given to everybody in this survey cohort, they scored just above folks with associate's degrees. So again, the conclusions that we can draw from this are that the near completers are about as expected on most college access and success predictor variables. Looking at the data, some of what I wasn't able to show, because we're still kind of analyzing it, is that it looks like there may be some disparities in this population by racial and ethnic background. It looks like ethnic minorities may be overrepresented as near completers. And that certainly holds true with what you might find from completion rates in undergraduate, et cetera. But this could be another way to help close the degree gap between different racial and ethnic backgrounds. So of course that data comes with a lot of caveats because we can't present stuff like this without it. But that's just one data source, and it's a preliminary analysis, but it's certainly something that we'll be looking at in a lot more detail in the coming years. The other big question that's still not answered to any satisfactory degree is how many adults are out there who have a lot of college credit. If we look at the census numbers, they have the some college, no degree category. We know that that's 37 million individuals in the country, roughly over 20%, between 20 and 25% of the population. But that includes those who have 2 credits all the way up to those who have 150 credits but no degree. So looking at this sample, what we find is that the near completers, those who have at least 2 years of college but no degree, make up 6 to 10% of the sample. So that can be useful for helping to plan how reaching this population might help a city, might help a state reach their attainment goals. So that's a little bit of the background and the foundation for the discussion. Kind of what I wanted to turn to now is talking about the role that cities can play in adult degree and certificate completion, and also some of what we're finding works, basically from the lessons that members of the Adult College Completions Network are finding in their work so far. So when we started this work, even before the network that we now operate, typically what we did, and it was mainly due to our bias as a state policy organization, is that we would work with state higher education agencies and institutions of higher ed, try to bring everyone together, work on policies and practices, identify the barriers to degree completion, and hopefully at the end of the day we'd remove some of those barriers and more adults would come back and finish degrees. What we're finding now in the Adult College Completion Network is that there's a much broader universe of stakeholders. There's still institutions and state higher ed agencies that are key players, but there are a lot of other actors that are really important to engage and that really can have a big impact on adult completion efforts. And if I highlight some of the ones that have close relationships at the city level, you can see that cities can really become more of the hub rather than a periphery stakeholder. Hello?
You're still with us.
Oh, okay. It said my connection's been lost. Is the slide showing up with the yellow boxes?
We're at the one with the pinkish red boxes that has increased degree completion at the bottom.
All right. Yeah, it's not advancing. Huh. Well.
1 second. We'll work on fixing that. Sorry about that.
Okay. I'll keep talking, and we can kind of catch up maybe as we go. But so anyway, the next slide that you're currently not able to see, and I apologize for that, it shows how cities can really be kind of a hub of a lot of these different organizations. Cities have very close relationships with chambers of commerce, with community organizations, with local employers. And that's, I think, an emerging key role in the adult college completion puzzle. So it's something that we're really starting to see emerge in groups like the Talent Dividend and some of the work that National League of Cities and others are doing is really starting to make this happen. Now, Catherine, do you think, would it work if you advance the slides?
That's what we were just thinking. I think that's what Mark was hopping on right now and doing. So right now, we'll go ahead and control it, and if everything's working smoothly, I'll chime in and let you know. So as of right now, we'll man that. Sorry about that.
All right.
Pat, I just tried to give you the control again. I don't know if you'll be able to have control or if you can even see what the slides are, but if you can't control it, I can control it.
Okay, let me give it another try. So now there should be a slide up about what do we know about collaborative efforts.
No.
Oh, it's
all right, I will.
Now it's the green bar is progressing, but no, it's back to red. Sorry about this. Okay, Mark Ebner was made the presenter. Okay, So maybe I'll keep going, and then Mark, do you want to try to catch up as far as slides? So that 18th slide would be perfect. So what do we know about collaborative efforts? There's been a lot of research, and I'm sure folks have seen quite a bit of it about collective impact. It's kind of the hot topic that's out there these days. Everybody's talking about it, whether they're foundations or others. And really what it's about is the type of work that you guys are already doing. It's trying to bring diverse stakeholders together and unite them around a common agenda to solve a specific problem. So Mark, if you could go to the next slide. There is a lot of research that's out there, both from Stanford and from the academic world, about why some of these collective efforts succeed and why others fail. And some of the biggest factors that you see are that these successful efforts have a very common, explicit agenda. And they're also measuring the same things and reporting on their metrics in a common way. And I think when you look at the different stakeholders that are involved from some of those earlier slides, you can really see how this can be, this could get out of control in some networks. If you have businesses involved, if you have institutions of higher education involved, cities, state agencies, everybody has kind of a different goal or a different target. So trying to find what some of the commonalities might be and what some of the ways that you can identify common metrics is really a key, and that's kind of one of the most important factors. Based on some of that research, I just wanted to throw out some questions that are useful, and I think a lot of the organizations that are doing the work in the talent dividend are really far along on this. And honestly, when I talk about this in other audiences, some of the work that you guys are doing is what I kind of hold up as an example. But if you think about who's the backbone organization, who's leading the initiative, and what their goals are, and making sure that all the different people involved are kind of united around the same specific goal and measuring their progress in the same way. The big question at the end is, how will we know if we're successful? And that's something I'll talk about more at the end when we talk a little bit about evaluation. But it's really crucial, even if you don't call it evaluation, to think about this in terms of how do we know what we're doing actually works. So if we could go on to the next slide. And then we can go ahead to the next one. So from here, what I'd like to talk about is some of the specific things that the projects we've worked with are finding are successful. Excuse me. Marketing and outreach is obviously one of the most important things. When we survey some of our network members and just going around the country talking to people, the key question that always comes up is, how do you find these adults and how do you get them to come back? And what we're seeing is that you can kind of categorize these approaches in about 3 broad strands of marketing and outreach. And these get blended and mixed and combined in all sorts of ways. But the first one up there is the data mining and direct targeting. And this is something that institutions can do and state systems can do if they've got access to student data. And basically, you're just going in and looking at your former students, trying to identify the ones that are within certain criteria of reaching a degree, and then reaching out, contacting them, and bringing them back to finish a degree. The people that we're working with are kind of coalescing around, and if you could just go back for a second, sorry. As far as data mining goes, folks are generally working around a common approach. The first, as I said, is to identify those students and based on the certain criteria that the project develops, but then filtering that list through the National Student Clearinghouse to get rid of all those who may have transferred and completed elsewhere, and kind of reduce the list to a more manageable size. Then people are turning to some of the big private data aggregators that are out there. This is companies like Axiom or Experian or some of the alumni finding organizations, and that work can be adapted to give people clean and up-to-date contact information. These companies have data on everybody in the country, and they can find current contact information based on old addresses and and names. So it's very helpful. It's actually pretty reasonably priced, and it ends up giving folks a much cleaner list. So the other, then folks are doing all sorts of things, whether it's phone, email, letters, to really reach out to these students and to try to bring them back. The response rates we're seeing range from 2% up to 10, 11%. And that 10, 11% response rate we think is actually pretty good. These are projects that have been very good about testing their messages. They're constantly, when they send out emails, they're using different messages that resonate well with students, and I'll talk about some of those in a second. But they're also constantly refining their messaging. And these folks have used a lot of professional help, and I think that definitely pays off in the long run. It may be slightly expensive at the beginning, but it's a lot cheaper than failure. So the other two main approaches, the first is kind of the publicity-based campaign where people launch a large, well-branded, high-profile effort. And one of the keys here is to get all of the different partners concentrating on publicizing the opportunities. That means that large employers that might be part of it are getting the word out to their employees. Government services, whether it's at the city or the state level, if it's a social service, maybe they're just having information about a degree completion program that they hand out to people as they come in to meet with counselors or meet with any sort of government officials there. Some states have also been able to put messages about degree completion programs onto the phone when folks call in. For example, calling into the Social Security Administration being put on hold, they get a message about degree completion, and here's some organizations that can help, and here's a website that you might want to go to if you think you could, or if you think you're close to earning a degree. These approaches also take advantage of free publicity and free media. The news media is always interested in a good story, so if you can present graduates and successful stories about people who have overcome challenges and have gone back and gotten degrees, the news media, certainly not every day, but on a relatively regular basis, they seem to be willing to publish these stories, whether it's a local newspaper, local news, on TV, or something like that. The projects that we've worked with have found that when they get these stories into the media, it kind of has a snowball effect, and they'll find somebody coming into their office, a week, a month later, with a newspaper clipping that talks about the story, and somebody passed it on to them. So it seems like this is a very successful way to reach out to this population. The formal advertising campaigns are obviously a little bit more expensive, and another place where professional help really pays off. Some of the best evaluated work that's out there, I think, comes from Georgia, where they've launched a large statewide advertising campaign. And they've been able to document some specific changes based on the institutions that are participating, that the ad campaign has made a difference and it's moved the needle on their adult enrollment. And when I talk about the messages in just a second, a lot of that work comes from some focus groups that Georgia and others have done. So Mark, if we could switch over to the next slide. So the messages that folks have found that resonate are some of what you'd expect and some of what you might not expect. What the research is showing is that both the extrinsic motivation, which we think of as material benefits and material gains, are important, but there's also a lot of intrinsic motivation, and these are psychological and emotional messages that really appeal to people. So some of the intrinsic messages are up there on the screen, but it's a lot about finding that others are in the same situation, that the adults who are going through this aren't on their own, and that there are schools that may be a good fit for them. And if you think about it, that might make sense because these adults left for some reason. Maybe they had a negative experience in higher education, but there are schools that are a better fit for them. Another message that seems to resonate quite well is the idea of finishing something that you've started in the past. Both West Virginia and Georgia and Texas are really finding that this is an important message. The extrinsic motivation that seems to be resonating is a lot of what you'd expect, that there are financial and economic benefits to returning to complete a degree. These are the things, the tagline there, the more you earn, or the more you learn, the more you earn, is something that they've tested in Minnesota as a subject line to an email that goes out to their former students. And that's something that they've gotten a very high click-through and a high enrollment rate off of. So these are things, there's a growing body of evidence, and I know that folks on the webinar are probably doing their own marketing and outreach, and we're always interested in adding to this knowledge base. So that if there are messages that you think are really working well, we'd love to hear about them. We'd love to hear what your data are showing. And Mark, if we could go to the next slide. So here are just a couple of examples. This is some marketing materials from Georgia, and you can click through to the next one. This is another example from Georgia. So that first message was kind of more the intrinsic motivation. This one is a little bit more about changing careers and showing some of the extrinsic motivation. And here from West Virginia, this is a message about finishing that they found has been useful, they found has been effective in bringing some adults back. We can go on to the next slide. So up on our website, the link is there, but there's a growing body of examples if folks are interested in some of the marketing materials that are out there. Again, this is an area where we're always adding examples and work from whoever's out there trying to reach this population. So if you do have marketing examples, whether it's a brochure, whether it's a radio ad, internet ads, etc., we'd certainly love to see that and add it to our library. The big challenge, again, that I'll talk about a little bit towards the end, is evaluating the effectiveness of this work. So Mark, could we go on to the next slide? Another form of outreach and marketing that I think gets overlooked somewhat is the idea of building the stakeholder support and building the network of folks that are committed to this mission. And what we find and what some of the research shows is that the decision makers out there, whether they're in the government, whether they're in business, whether they're in nonprofit organizations, folks aren't necessarily always data driven. They're not necessarily just looking at the data and looking at what the best outcomes might be. But what they're finding is that these folks are often very responsive to stories and emotions. We're certainly not saying that you should abandon data-driven decision-making and that everybody's just kind of running around willy-nilly making decisions based on how they feel. But the research is pretty clear that having data and stories combined together is a really powerful way to motivate people. So if you think about reaching out to government officials and you can present stories about their constituents that show why adult completion is important and what benefits it has to the constituent, that can be really important to reaching that group. If you talk about reaching out to business leaders, talking about how some of their employees might grow and how some of their employees might maybe rise up to middle management and higher levels of management through education, that can be very powerful. And the same thing when you're talking to students themselves. Having some stories about others like them that have gone through programs and succeeded can be very powerful. And if we could go on to the next one. So engaging higher ed. Certainly, and this is a little bit of a delicate discussion to get into, but I think it's fair to say that higher ed isn't perfect, and that oftentimes folks working outside of higher ed have a pretty good idea of ways that higher ed can improve. But with that being said, it's not necessarily easy to jump in and fix higher ed, and certainly folks in higher ed aren't always, and I'm certainly one of them, we're not always super responsive to criticism from the outside. But that being said, I think that projects like those in the Talent Dividend Network that are based at the metropolitan level can play a key role in advocating for effective policies and practices. And there's a list of those that are coming up on the screen now. And if you talk about some of these, I think a lot of people are familiar with prior learning assessment. This is the idea that you should get college credit for what you know. But the people who may not be familiar with it are those in the business community. But once you explain to them that if there are good prior learning assessment policies, when their employees go back, they're not learning things that they already know. They're getting new information. They're getting credit for what they've already done. And unfortunately, across higher ed, there's not universal acceptance of PLA. You still see resistance at the institutional level. Some states are farther ahead than others. But a key entry point into talking about this, we think, is with military students. Military and veterans come back to higher ed, and they have a huge amount of training. And this training has been evaluated by folks like the American Council on Education, ACE. And those training evaluations are done by faculty from institutions across the country. And once they do those evaluations, they offer credit recommendations. And a lot of institutions, but certainly not all, accept those so that somebody who comes in, maybe they were
I think we might be having some technical difficulties.
a prior learning assessment, competency-based learning. I think these are things that a lot of people are aware of, but as we deal with broader and broader networks of stakeholders that are working to bring adults back, making sure that people understand how these types of policies and practices can benefit adults, and being able to talk about them with people who may not be familiar with them is very important. The cost of earning a degree. I think this is still one of the key barriers for most adults. And I know there's some new research coming out on Monday from Public Agenda, and again, I think that kind of reinforces what a lot of people have found across the country, is that when you talk to an adult about going back to college, one of the first questions they ask is, how am I going to pay for that? Unfortunately, I don't think that we can wave a magic wand, have lower tuition rates, have higher state and federal funding, and new financial aid programs for these students. But there are things that schools can do that lowers the cost for adults. There are open educational resources that can eliminate textbook costs. Better advising can help adults complete degrees a lot more quickly, so you're paying for less semesters of school. Another key area that I think cities are uniquely positioned to improve policy and practice is in the collaboration between workforce and higher ed. These are two entities that are broadly working towards the same end. If somebody comes into a workforce center, they're looking for skills and training that can hopefully give them a better job. That's also a key role for higher ed. But unfortunately, what we see is there isn't always a lot of collaboration between the two. There's no reason that somebody who comes into a workforce training center with 120 credits and only needs 1 or 2 classes to earn a degree shouldn't be able to get information there about a local institution of higher ed that offers a degree completion program and can help them finish in a semester. So that's something that I think mayors especially can really play a key role. They can bring institutions to the table. They have a unique place kind of at the center of local workforce boards. That's really important for improving some of that collaboration. And I think we could go on to the next slide. So employers is another area that folks have done a lot of work on in identifying some of the key practices that the private sector can take to increase adult completion. And we can go on to the next one. So if you look at these, and if you do a couple more clicks, that should be good. That's perfect. There's a lot of things that businesses can do to improve how their employees are able to access higher ed. The very simple ones that are kind of highlighted at the top of the list don't necessarily cost employers much at all. These are things like identifying potential students, conducting outreach and marketing through their HR departments. Some larger employers are actually able to provide classroom space and hold classes at their place of employment. When you get down towards the bottom, start looking at tuition assistance and evaluating company training through the ACE credit program. The ACE credit program is like ACE's evaluations of military training, and through that, folks are able to, if they work for IBM and do certain training, ACE has evaluated it and suggests certain levels of credit for that. Employers have to pay a little bit for that, but it's, again, something that can help their employees advance towards a degree. And if you can go on to the next slide. Some of the research, and I'll talk quickly about this because we're running out of time, but the research on the return on investment for employers, it's pretty clear that there is a benefit to employers themselves for tuition assistance. And we'd like to talk about tuition assistance rather than reimbursement. The research shows that where employers provide the assistance up front rather than requiring employees to pay for it up front, that they get a lot higher usage rate. But the bottom line is that tuition assistance lowers recruitment costs, it increases retention, so employers spend less time trying to find qualified employees. There's some great research about what Verizon has been able to do through their main education program. Their own estimates suggest that they've saved $25 million. We could go on to the next slide. These are just a couple of examples of organizations that have put together recommendations for employers, kind of promising practices, and employers agree to do certain things, and then they get listed on the website in some of these cases and kind of champion for the work that they're doing. But those might be worth taking a look at. And we could go on to the next slide. So I did want to talk a little bit to wrap up about evaluation. This is a little bit of an awkward topic. Nobody likes to talk about evaluation. But I think it's a key for sustainability. A better word would be knowing what works. It certainly costs a lot of money. It's difficult. It's not always clear-cut what the results are. But it's much better than investing in failure. If we could look at the next slide. Oftentimes what we see out of evaluations, here's a project in, in hypothetical city. The project starts, they start tracking adult enrollment. After 5 years, we've seen that adult enrollment has gone way up. That's terrific. But it doesn't really tell us much about what's working. So if you could go to the next slide. The key to evaluating these sorts of projects is developing some sort of comparison. So in this case, if we were to superimpose over the top of Project X data from another city that did not have a project, what you would see in this case is that, yes, while the adult enrollment increased in city Y, it also increased in city Z that wasn't trying to do anything. So this may be due to a broader trend in the economy. And this is certainly something that we've seen with the big economic downturn. More adults are going back to college. So while we'd love to take credit for that, it's not necessarily something that can be proven to be part of our projects. And if you go on to the next slide. So here, and this gets somewhat complicated, but I think in collaborative networks, such as the Talent Dividend Network, you're able to take advantage of situations where cities are starting projects at different times. So if you track some of these metrics and some of these different figures, if you could see here, the yellow project starts a year later than the white project, and the green project starts 2 years later. If we could start to plug all of that data in and really collaborate across cities and across projects, we can start to build a much stronger case for what works in adult college completion or really any education program. And this is kind of the key for sustainability. We talk about that a lot. And one of the best practices in sustainability is undertaking a program that works. And the way that we can show programs work is really by comparing them across geographies, across time, and really asking and answering tough questions about the success of projects. So that's kind of my final thought on evaluation. We could go on, I think, the next 2 slides and we'd be finished, and we can take any questions that folks have. And then one more slide, I think, has the contact information. And that's pretty much all I've got. Thank you to everyone, and sorry for the technical difficulties, but I'd be happy to answer any questions. And if you have other questions that you'd like to email or give me a call, I'd be happy to take those and follow up with you as well.
Thank you again, Patrick, for joining us. We haven't received any questions at the moment. Again, if anyone that's listening does have questions, please feel free to enter them to us. We'll hang on for a few more moments. But again, we really do, on behalf of the Talent Dividend and CEOs for Cities, want to thank Patrick for coming out and sharing his expertise. Apologies again to everyone listening for the technical difficulties, but I still think it was a really great webinar and such important information to gain. I think just a few more minutes. Patrick, do you have any lasting impressions or any last comments to share before we go ahead and close the webinar?
Nothing really. I mean, I think I would just emphasize again that it's not really a members-only network, that we'd be happy to have anybody that's on the webinar join, share what they're doing. What we really like to do is to connect people. So if there are cases where you would like to talk to an expert in prior learning assessment or something like that, we'd be happy to connect you with people that we work with that kind of live and breathe specific topics. So we'd really just like to be a resource in all the great work that you're doing.
Oh, wonderful. And we actually did get some questions, which is great. The first one is, do you find that people often matric from continuing ed programs as a soft entry, or certain programs to degree, perhaps?
I think there's not a lot of great data out there on that. That's a great question, though. You know, the difference between the continuing ed programs and the 4-credit programs is, I think, a tough one, because on the one hand, some of the certificates that people are earning as they go through continuing ed programs can be very valuable in the workplace, but there's a question about how kind of their long-term value and their portability. So that's something that, again, is a difficult data question to answer. And certainly if you had any insights on it or even anecdotes, we kind of look at anecdotes as a singular version of data, and if we can collect enough of them, that's something that can start to shed light on those questions. So sorry, that's not a great answer, but it's a good question.
And continuing off that, we have a question asking, are the marketing efforts that are successful combined with services, or are they purely marketing?
They're definitely combined with services, and that's a point I probably should have made very clear. One of the worst marketing approaches I think that people could undertake is to just start advertising with great messages to attract people to come back to college, and then they show up and there's nothing to help them overcome their unique barriers and challenges. There's nothing to help them with old credits, which is something that adults face. There's nothing to help them, you know, collect transcripts from 5 or 6 different institutions. So really having the services in place is kind of a key. It gets into a little bit of a chicken or the egg discussion, that you can't have great services until you've got the students to take advantage of them. But really identifying what some of the barriers are at the institutional level is key before having folks come back. I know one thing that's been pretty successful as part of these marketing approaches is having a single point of contact that folks can call. It's called different things around the country. Some places have called it a concierge in Nevada, and that came out of folks in Las Vegas where they love their hotel concierges. But you know, there's an advertisement to call this number if you're interested in coming back, and they get put in touch with a specific person who can help them and who works only with these returning adults. And they may not be able to answer every question, but they can guide them through some of the, you know, the difficult pitfalls of the admissions process. So really having those services in place is kind of a key before marketing.
Great. Another question is, what experience have communities had in focusing on hands-on versus academic education in terms of completion rate?
These are very difficult questions. Unfortunately, the completion rate question is something we don't, again, have a lot of great data on, and that's something we're trying to work with people around the country. But knowing what's working in specific programs is very difficult. I think some of the initial data that we have by hands-on, thinking about more vocationally oriented certificates, some of the work the American Association of Community Colleges has done around the country, and they were specifically targeting adults who were more than 50 years old to come back and finish a degree or a certificate. and they had a lot more success getting folks back to complete certificates that were kind of vocationally oriented. And so I think for that population, what they were finding is it's a lot of people who are unemployed, or the industry in their town had closed down and they needed quick reskilling. So that's certainly, if you talk about the diverse nature of the adult population out there with some credit but no degree, those that are unemployed are probably looking to get back into the workforce as quickly as possible, and having something hands-on that can really help them in that is a key. One of the innovations that the National Association of Manufacturers is working on, and some others as well, are the stackable.
I do think we might have lost him again. I do apologize for this, but we are approaching that 1 p.m. time mark. So at this point, we'll go ahead and make sure all the slides and the recording will be posted on our event page at ceusforcities.org/events. And just take a moment and make sure to capture Patrick's contact information. I'm sure any further questions or comments, he would love to hear them. So on behalf of Talent Dividend Network and Youth for Cities, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it, and thanks again. Have a great day. Bye-bye.